Hello. Hello. Hello, and yeah, it's so lovely to welcome you to Big Questions this week. Yes, I'm Dorothy, if we haven't met before. I'm a third year studying law at Trinity Hall. Thanks, Joanna. And yeah, I'm also part of the Christian Union. And one of the things that we love to do is to put on events like this where we can provide a space to ask big questions about life, about faith, about life's meaning, and about the claims of Christianity. So that's what Big Questions events are all about. You may have come to the 3 other ones that we put on this term. We've got one more next week. But yes, here we are today with a big question. And the big question that we're thinking about today, the big topic, is to judge or not to judge Jesus, cancel culture, and you. And I'm just going to give you a little overview of what the structure of today is going to look like. Please feel free to grab a sandwich if you haven't yet. So we're going to have about like a 20-minute or so talk, a short talk on that topic that I just mentioned from Robbie, who's here with us today, and you met him at previous weeks. Then we will have, from about past, we'll have about 20 minutes or so, depending on like how long we're kind of here for, to like just have a conversation. Do just get to know people on your table. Do chat about what you thought about the talk or about the sandwiches, or whatever you like. But I'd really encourage you, as you're listening to the talk, and in that conversation, to really like chat about what you thought, whether you like really disagree with stuff. And if you do have questions, do feel free to chat them on the table. Do feel free to pop them down on the feedback forms that you'll find. Please put any questions that you'd like love to get answered on there, if they're not answered during the talk. And also, do feel free to use those little booklets that you may find on your table. If you flick through a few pages, you'll get to the particular bit of the booklet that's relevant to today. Do feel free to chat about the questions that are on there, the bits of the Bible that may have been mentioned in the talk, or anything like that. Do use them as you like. During that time for discussion that I mentioned, there'll be a Q&A link up on the screens. Do plug your questions into there, and if we have lots of questions, then we'll have a short time Q&A at the end. And yes, that will be how it goes. We'll have the building for a bit longer, so do feel free to stay and chat. But also, do feel free to run if you've got a lecture or supervision or something you've got to run to. Cool. So I'm going to invite Robbie up now. Do feel free to use the actual stage. Oh, that's nice. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks,
I'll sit down. So, Robbie, what is your name and what do you get up to in life?
Yeah, my name's Robbie. I actually work at this church, particularly with undergraduate students. Yeah.
Cool, wonderful. And, oh, am I still on? I don't know. I'll just shout loud anyway. And Robbie, just, a little bit of a get to know. Obviously, today's topic is about, like, culture, kind of a lot about the culture that we live in today. I guess a lot of that times that we see that is on social media. So, like, Robbie, you a big social media person? Favorite social media?
Oh, man. I feel so old now. I think I sometimes still use Facebook a little bit, but to be honest, I haven't posted in a long time. I did ask someone the other day whether I should think about getting TikTok, and they were like, just don't bother. Yeah. Too old.
Fair enough. Lovely, lovely. And yeah, so I'm just going to give a quick intro to the conversation that we could check about. Yeah, so we'll just step down. Feel free to down. So sometimes it feels like we live in a society of an increasing level of acceptance of different beliefs, that we live in a really progressive society where you can do you can express yourself as you like, be yourself, and love yourself as you choose. But at the same time, it can often feel like we live in a society that is increasingly hostile. We live in a society of online hate crime, of trolling, of keyboard warriors, of cancel culture, and a lot of the times hate. So how do we kind of balance those both? How do we kind of think about those big questions of pursuing justice whilst also holding on to the standard of being kind to ourselves and being kind to others? Do we judge others? How much should we judge others? How do we be kind and yet be just? How much space is there for forgiveness? And does Jesus, a man who was on earth about 2,000 years ago, have any relevant response or anything relevant to say about those questions? So Robbie's now going to speak to us a bit about that for the next few minutes or so, and you'll see me in a few minutes' time.
Thanks so much. Dorothy, can I just say you nailed that introduction? I don't think you're going to answer any of those questions, but we'll have a little go. at some of it. I don't know what you thought when you came to the talk title, or when you thought about coming to this talk, Jesus, cancel culture and you, to judge or not to judge. I don't know how you feel about that phrase. It's kind of a controversial thing. To be honest, as I've prepared over the last couple of weeks, I've been like, oh man, what have I taken on? The phrase is tossed around all over the news and social media. For some people, it conjures up a kind of social media mob hunting down something to be offended about. So today, literally today, the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, Conservative MP, said, left-wing activists have hijacked social media. Can't say anything anymore. For others, though, the concept of cancelling or calling somebody out is a totally legitimate way of exposing injustice and hypocrisy and asking for change in someone's behaviour that's kind of problematic. It's about holding people accountable for their actions. I don't know how you feel about the phrase. What we're going to do over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm briefly going to try and introduce what I think I mean by cancel culture. I'm aware that even using cancel culture as a two-word phrase, it implies in some circles a bit of a political opinion. Now, you'll notice I put it in like scare quotes up there. I'm just using it as shorthand to kind of describe our current kind of cultural moment. I'll talk a bit about that. And then I think I'll try and say one thing that this phenomenon shows us about ourselves, and one question it asks of ourselves. And then just a couple of reflections, because I'm a Christian, you're at a Christian event, about the person at the heart of the Christian faith, Jesus Christ, and whether he has anything to say into this sort of cultural space. Is that all right? That's where we're going, basically. Whether or not you want to use it, it's become a key part of life lived publicly in this decade. The original word cancel comes from the Latin to cross out. It's the kind of thing that scribes would have done on words, put literally a line through them. And I guess in more modern society, 20th century, 21st century, cancel is a consumerist verb, isn't it? You think about cancelling your Netflix subscriptions or studio heads cancelling TV shows. As far as I can tell, the first kind of popular reference to cancelling a person rather than a thing comes either from a song by Nile Rodgers and the band Chic or a kind of 90s gangster classic TV show called New Jack City. I've actually got a clip from the show, I think it's 1991, just to show you the phrase in its original context. Matthew is an absolute whiz on this tech stuff. Let's see if it works.
Keisha.
You're a murderer, Nino! I've seen you kill too many people, Nino!
Cancel that. I'll buy another.
I don't know if you caught it. It's pretty horrific, actually, when you start thinking about it. It's a kind of, he's a mob gangster. He's just done a bunch of murdering. And one of his kind of girlfriends, or who, I don't know who, says to him, "You're a murderer." And he says, "Cancel that expletive. I'll buy another one." It's horrific, isn't it, really? It's kind of not a very nice little clip. But it turns out it makes a great meme. And that's exactly what happened. So via references in raps by 50 Cent and Lil Wayne and stuff, and then there's a reality TV show called Love and Hip Hop, by the 2010s, the concept of cancelling somebody has found a home online in what some commentators call Black Twitter. Now, the idea was for people who didn't feel like they had much agency to call out something that they thought was wrong or offensive, but often it was kind of a light-hearted way. It's kind of like, I'll share a bit of a meme and it's a bit of a joke. But sometimes it can be serious too. So here's someone called Anne Charity Hudley, who's the chair of linguistics of African America at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Can we have that quote up? She says, when you see people cancelling Kanye or whatever, cancelling other people, it's a collective way of saying, we elevated your social status, your economic prowess, and we're not going to pay attention to you in the way that we once did. I may have no power, but the power I have is to ignore you. See what she's saying? In the last few years, though, it's not hard to trace some of the key moments in recent history that have taken this phrase from a kind of little enclave of the internet into the mainstream. Hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Black Lives Matter, debates about freedom of speech on university campuses, Brexit, Donald Trump, the increasing polarization between left and right in the political world, and the fact that we spent like 18 months of the last kind of 2 years, like literally on our own, in front of our screens during the pandemic where everything was just heightened and intensified. It's no wonder, we can take this one down, thanks Matthew, it's no wonder that opinions are pretty strong on both sides of the debate, whether you like the concept or not. These things that we're talking about are really deep and important topics, aren't they? For some, cancel culture was the nail in the coffin of free speech and open debate. So there was a letter published in an American journal called Harper's Magazine back in July 2020, which spoke out, I've got this one as well, against a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of difference in favor of ideological conformity. People didn't like it. For others, though, the whole idea that cancel culture exists is just a bogeyman. It doesn't exist, according to the National Union of Students in this country. And they point out that many of those who claim to be cancelled seem to gain quite a lot of public attention when they draw the attention to the fact that they have been cancelled. Very few cancelled public figures suffer significant career setbacks. They seem to sell a lot of books, basically, as soon as they say they've been cancelled on Twitter. It's been a topic that comes pretty close to home in this city too. According to one think tank, Cambridge University is one of the worst institutions in the country for free speech. And last year there were some pretty big debates amongst academics in the city about a change in policy to the university's free speech policy. You might have seen 2 weeks ago, the art historian Andrew Graham Dixon did an impersonation of Adolf Hitler at a Cambridge Union debate, and that kind of kicked off and everyone got cross. And John Cleese, literally just a few days ago, posted this on his Twitter. Have we got that one as well, Matthew? I was looking forward to talking to students at the Cambridge Union, but I hear that someone there's been blacklisted for doing an impersonation of Hitler. I regret that I did the same on a Monty Python show, so I'm blacklisting myself before someone else does. Next one. I apologise to anyone in Cambridge who was hoping to talk with me, but perhaps some of you can find a venue where woke rules do not apply. Now, it's kind of ironic to cancel yourself, but we'll leave that to one side. And I've got limited time. We can't delve into all the debates about free speech and all that, and they are fascinating. If you want to ask about them, you can. Instead, I want to say, like I said earlier, one thing that I think cancel culture reveals about us, and one question it asks about us, and then we'll think about Jesus. Here's the thing. I think cancel culture shows that we really want people to face the consequences of their actions. Okay, we have a very strong and high view of what's right and wrong and what's just. Lots of people point out that my generation, millennials, and your generation, Generation Z, have a very strong sense of justice. And viewed sympathetically, that is what cancel culture is all about, isn't it? At its best, it's about trying to help people or force people to face the consequences for things that they do or say that are wrong. So this guy, American actor LeVar Burton, I think puts it quite well in this little clip from the American chat show called The View.
In terms of cancel culture, I think it's misnamed. That's a misnomer. I think we have a consequence culture, and that consequences are finally encompassing everybody in the society, whereas they haven't been ever in this country.
See what he's saying? Rather than calling it cancel culture, that's a misnomer, he says. Better to think about consequences. Both sides of the debate agree that if you do something that is not good, you should face the consequences for it. Even if you're the kind of person who thinks that speech should be completely free all of the time, no holds barred, vigorous debate, you'll still want people to be held accountable for stuff that they say that is not right. So imagine if someone lies in court, that person should be charged with perverting the course of justice under the Perjury Act. That's not right. And we want to hold ourselves accountable, hold others accountable too. It's actually always been like this. One of the first boycotts in history was back in the 1820s. It was set up by a Christian woman called Elizabeth Hayrick, and she boycotted sugar in support of the abolitionist movement to try and get slavery outlawed. 300,000 families stopped buying sugar in the UK, and it was one of the key things that led to emancipation of, kind of the abolition of the slave trade in the UK at least. The existence of a cancel culture reveals our very strong sense of what is right and wrong, our sense of justice. We want people to face the consequences of their actions, and that's surely a good thing, isn't it? But here's the question that we're forced to ask ourselves. Are we ready to face the consequences of our own actions? One of the things that leaves a bit of a funny taste in the mouth when somebody gets cancelled is if that person's not like a Harvey Weinstein or whatever, but instead is just a normal person with a normal job. There's been a few examples of this. One I came across, somebody called Brian Leach, a 54-year-old disabled till worker at Asda in Dewsbury. He was sacked from his job because he shared a video online of Billy Connolly, who's a comedian, talking about religion. And when regular people like that get called out on social media, sometimes the impact can be massive and devastating on their families and their lives and their careers. Now, that guy was actually reinstated back to his job. But it helps us to think about that question, doesn't it? When it could be anyone in this room, anyone just randomly working at the tills in Asda? Are we ready to face the consequences of our own actions in the way that we call others to account? I don't know if you've come across the dystopian TV series Black Mirror. It's really good. And there's an episode called Hated in the Nation, where it kind of explores this topic. People who are hated online get tweeted about with the hashtag #death2. Each day, the person with the most #death2 hashtags and mentions is killed by automated drone insects that fly around and kill them. It's a pretty extreme episode, but it is a gripping 8 to 9 minutes. I'd recommend watching it. I won't give the end away, but there is a twist that asks searching questions about whether those who point the finger are willing to face the same standards themselves. So cancel culture shows our very high view of justice, but it also asks us a pretty penetrating question. Are we willing to face the consequences of our own speech and actions in the same way that we want to call others out? But what has all this got to do with Jesus? Like, we're in a church, like we're at a Christian event. What's all this got to do with him? Well, there's one famous story about Jesus that I'd like to share. It's a slightly funny story because if you read one of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life and go back to the very earliest manuscripts, it's actually not there. It kind of goes in the 5th century, but it has all the hallmarks of an eyewitness account, and even if it didn't happen, and you can ask about this afterwards, the message of it is pretty cool, and it's reiterated basically across all of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. But the story goes like this. Jesus is in the temple courts, and some religious leaders bring to him a woman who's been caught in adultery. According to the law, they say, we should stone her because she's been caught in adultery. And Jesus replies, let anyone who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And I love the way the story is told. One by one, those who heard began sheepishly to leave. The older ones first, interesting, people who've lived longer, experienced, more mature, until just Jesus was left with the woman. And Jesus is doing something on the ground. He kind of looks up and goes, Has no one stayed? No one, she says. Well, then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. That's a great story, and it kind of resonates, doesn't it? One friend of mine reminded me of the Shakespeare play, Merchant of Venice. There's a famous scene, if you study English, you'll know this scene, where the character Portia warns Shylock, and was one of the other characters, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. The character wants justice to be done, but Portia warns, watch out for what you ask for. And my friend has written a book, and he says this, the point is a profound one. We might all long for people to face the consequences of their actions and cry out for it, but we should pause and reflect on that desire. Justice must, by definition, be universal. This means that the standards of justice are not met if they're applied to some and not others. That's bias and partiality, the opposite of justice. So when we long to have a just and better world, we have to ask ourselves the uncomfortable question, how do we fare when our lives are put under the microscope of justice? It's a good question, isn't it? Just be honest with yourself for a moment and think about it. How does your life fare when you put it under the microscope of justice? When you read the Gospels, and I'd really encourage you to do that, if you've never done that before as a thinking adult, as a student, it's a great time whilst you're at uni to think about this person, Jesus, and the claims that he made. When you read the Gospels, Jesus is an interesting character. He's quite hard to pin down. He doesn't fit neatly on either the political right or the political left. On the one hand, his standard of justice is really, really high. He was all about fairness and what is right. He cares about poverty and racism and corruption. He preaches a message of incredibly high moral standards. So if you've got one of these booklets, just look at it. Turn up. They haven't got page numbers, but it's actually the one that's right in the middle where the staples come in. So just go right to the very middle. And look at this little bit in Luke chapter 12. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. So Jesus has a huge platform. He's famous, crowd of thousands, and he calls his disciples and uses the opportunity to call out the hypocrisy of a religious elite. He has super high standards of justice, and we're cheering along thinking, yeah, absolutely, preach it. But then what he says is pretty shocking. It turns the finger on us. Verse 2, there's nothing concealed that will not be disclosed or hidden that will not be made known. What you've said in the dark will be heard in the daylight. What you've whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed on the roofs. Jesus comes to bring justice and peace on earth. Christians look forward to a new creation where there's going to be nothing more corrupt on this earth. But in order for that to happen, Jesus needs to deal first with the problem of injustice that is in us. Every thought and word and deed will be laid bare. When that guy, LeVar Burton, said consequences are finally encompassing everybody in society, it is, to be fair, a bit of an overstatement. But it's true that in our social media age, things we post online can catch up with us. This was brought home to me literally this morning. I was listening on the radio. I don't know if you followed the kind of scandal in English cricket about racism. There's a guy called Azeen Rafiq who's been a big whistleblower on how racist English cricket is. And a few days ago, people dug up anti-Semitic comments that he had made and an Instagram post that he'd shared about African people that wasn't particularly nice. But according to Jesus, one day, consequences will catch up with everybody. Now, you may or may not believe in God, right? I'm aware that obviously in a room like this, there are some people who are exploring, some people who are pretty convinced atheists, whatever. But if he does exist, if the God of the Bible exists, then his standards for what is right and wrong are very, very high. We've lived in this world, according to the Bible, as if he and his standards don't matter. Each one of us falls short. That's the claim of Jesus. His standards are super high. But on the other hand, Jesus is all about mercy. Do you remember what he says to the woman? Two things. Firstly, I don't condemn you. There's a verse up on the screen that's going to come up. John chapter 3, verse 16 is one of the most famous verses in the Bible. You probably heard it. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. But do you know what the verse says that comes after this? It says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Christians believe that a day of justice is coming, an ultimate day when all that is said and spoken and thought will be laid bare, and we're left to face the consequences of our actions, to perish, like it says in verse 16. But Jesus came in order to save and not condemn. Jesus was God come to earth. He lived a perfect life. His online back catalogue would have contained no compromising social media posts or stupid racist videos. But he faced an unfair mob justice, death, even cancellation, you might say, for the sake of people like you and me. He came to save. He's all about mercy. And the cool thing, the paradoxical thing, is that a life lived in response to the mercy and forgiveness of Jesus is absolutely transformative. It actually changes us. Remember the second thing Jesus says to the woman? Go and sin no more. Mercy is not about being let off the hook. It's not as if justice doesn't matter anymore. It's about experiencing something profound and deep that actually begins to change us on the inside. I'll put it really provocatively. If you want to become a better person, if you want to make the world a fairer place, even if you want to have just open and honest conversation about topics that really matter, then you need to have Jesus' mercy in your life. Pursuing justice without a profound experience of mercy and forgiveness just produces hypocrisy and cruelty and a hatred of others. It means you end up looking down on others. And I think that's evident on both sides of the cancel culture debate, no matter how you define what's right and wrong. An encounter with the mercy of God actually changes people. That's the claim of the Bible. And you can read, if you want, kind of what that's like in the other little passage that's on there, Luke 18. Perhaps discuss it with a friend or whatever. So we've seen, I think, that Jesus is this unique combination of justice and mercy. He calls out wrong, even the wrong in us, and he shows mercy on those who turn to him and empowers them to actually change. As we close, and you may want to ask questions and discuss and things like that, as we close, what does this all mean for cancel culture? What difference does this kind of attitude make to our next online conversation? Well, I'm sure there's loads to say, but when Jesus says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, the point of the story is not that human calls for justice need to be sinless. It's not that we can't have those kind of conversations or call out things that are wrong. The point is that because the only way we relate to God is on the basis of grace and mercy and genuine transformation and change, in a Christian worldview, as Christians look at the world, that is therefore the only way we should relate to others, with an expectation of forgiveness and grace, but also change and genuine transformation. And if you find that kind of way of having public conversations attractive or appealing, then I'd really encourage you to think more about the person who is right at the heart of this book, Jesus Christ. Because, as I put it earlier, provocatively, you can't have that kind of changed life. If you want to be a better person, you can't do it without an experience of his grace and forgiveness. That's all I've got to say. I'm sure there's loads of questions that you guys might want to send in. There's the pigeonhole thing. Just type in the password judge. And there's also discussion on tables. Dorothy, you coming back up?
Hello, everyone. Hello. We're just going to have a very short Q&A. As I mentioned a bit earlier, this may run a bit longer than 10 to, but feel free to leave if you like, and we'll definitely be finishing in like 5 or 10 minutes, so before 2 o'clock itself. The first question that's kind of at the top, sorry, the microphone's working weird, so we're kind of having to do a bit of a tag team thing here. The first question for Robbie is this one, and this has got the most votes so far. Does justice have to be selfless to still be valid? Or not self-serving to still be valid? Often those who call out people tend to gain from it. So how do we balance this risk against some objective standard? So does basically the pursuit of justice and calling out other people have to be non-self-serving? Robbie.
That is, it's a good question, although I'm sure I'm not going to answer it properly because there's probably lots going on there. So please come and chat to me afterwards if you want to explain it a bit better. But from what I understand, does justice have to be self-service? I mean, you can be unjustly just, if you like. You could do something right for a wrong motive. And according to the Christian understanding of kind of morality, that would not necessarily be a good thing. There are other definitions of morality and ethics and justice which would say that's absolutely fine, kind of utilitarian view of ethics or whatever. But a Christian view of ethics would say that actually the thing that you do and the reason why you do it, both of those need to be right. And that, I guess, it basically, the question gets to the heart of like, how do you actually define justice, which is something that we've been assuming and thinking about. I'm kind of saying, I think we all have a sense that there's something right and wrong, and we've got a strong sense of justice. I guess one of the interesting things, again, about sort of our generation is that we're not always very clear on how we define it. And I guess, intellectually, over the last sort of 100 years, 200 years, as believing in a God who would be the source of justice and the reason why justice exists, the kind of root of an objective justice, as we've ditched that in our society, it kind of leaves foundations for what justice actually means on much shakier ground. And so I think it's a really, really good question to ask. Why do I, if I think justice is right, if I think that there's such a thing as justice, why do I think that and how do I define it? And if you're a Christian, you're going to go to the Bible and you're going to go to the kind of understanding that Christians have had for thousands of years and try and understand it from there. If you're not a Christian, you're exploring things, you're from a different faith background or whatever, then chat to your Christian friends about why they think justice is justice and what they think about it. So I don't know if that answered that question or not, but it was a good one.
Thank you very much. The next most popular question is, what should be our response to injustice? Do we stop holding people accountable for their actions?
Yes, it's a really good question. The answer's no. It's still okay to, from the Bible anyway, from what Jesus says, it's still okay to hold people accountable for their actions. But I think the way that we do that has changed. So there's a really famous, if you've not read, by the way, the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' kind of like manifesto of ethics according to kind of God and stuff. It's really worth reading. It's really interesting. And there's a bit there in Matthew chapter 7 where, again, you probably heard this, it's very famous. He talks about judging others and says, do not judge or you too will be judged. In the same way as you judge others, you'll be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So that's the kind of stuff we've been saying. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in another's eye, but pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll be able to see clearly and help your brother with the speck. So it's not wrong to point out injustice in somebody else, but I guess what Jesus is saying is the way that a Christian is going to approach that is with a big dollop of humility and a sense that I'm not absolutely perfect as I do this. And that leads to a graciousness and a forgiving kind of attitude, but also one that's able to say, well, if you do something wrong, you've got to face the consequences of it. If someone commits a crime, they should go to prison. And I guess the Bible would kind of support that sort of thing. So no, it's not wrong to call out injustice, but I guess a kind of Christian view of the world would say, how exactly are you going to do that? And if you find that attractive, if you find what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 about the plank and the speck and things, then think a bit more about what he says.
No. I tried. Okay, maybe this does work. No. Okay, the next question that we're going to look at very briefly. Also, just as a quick thing, before you do leave, I mentioned those feedback questions. If any of your questions or anything doesn't get answered, do write down there, and there's a little box where you can just pop it off as you leave. And feel free to take one of the books that's on the bookstall there. They're free for you to take. Yes. Okay, the next question is, how is there room for growth if we're going to be judged on everything that we've ever done?
Thanks. I'm so glad someone asked this question, because I think it's a really, really good one. I think that little bit that we looked at from Luke chapter 12, where Jesus says one day there's going to be, like, the things that are in the dark are going to be revealed in the light. That's kind of scary. It's what Christians talk about when they talk about a judgment day or a day of justice. But the whole reason why Jesus came to earth was to die in our place for sinners, so that we wouldn't have to face that justice, but instead we would get his free gift of a just life. So I know that sounds a bit kind of crazy, but this is what it says in one of the bits of the Bible. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but all who believe are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came from Christ Jesus. Justified is like that kind of justice language, like it's the just language that we've been talking about. And Christians believe that people who trust in Jesus are made right before God and then slowly transformed to be a bit more like the rightness that God has given them. So there's still absolutely room for growth, because according to the very heart of the message of Christianity, there is a rescue from that coming judgment.
Wonderful. That may be all we have time for today. I'm just going to quickly check the rest of the thing. Oh, there's some more questions. Guys. Okay, we are going to have to stop because we said we'd finish 3 minutes ago. But those of you that had those questions or upvoted those questions, really honestly do chat to people on your table about it, or like Robbie's literally here, you can have your own personal Q&A, or put it on the feedback form, and we'd love to get in touch and chat more about that with you. Do feel free to take books, do carry on staying chatting. Just quickly though, before we finish, if I can invite Josh up for a second. We're here the same time next week, same place. I'm just going to let Josh mention a bit about that.
Great. My name's Josh. I'm from Zimbabwe. I work with international students in Cambridge. Next week, the question is, how can you say there's only one way to heaven? So if that's a question that you have on your mind, please come, please bring your friends. I guess there are a lot of questions behind that question. So what about other religions? What about people who've not heard about God? But also, how can you say how can we know that? One way to heaven, what is that way? What is heaven? What does that look like? So there's quite a lot there. I'm going to try and unpack some of it, hopefully just to prompt conversation on the tables. So do come back next week and bring your friends.
Thanks. And thanks so much. That's all you'll hear from the front for today. Once again, Robbie's there, books are there, forms, cards are on the table, and do stay for a bit longer. Thank you.